I'll start with a question. What is cult? Now it's easy to find any answer. You just Google it. And you have answer to any question. Any word that you type brings you a lot of information in the form of images, movies, music, in such a way that every word turns to be connected with any other word and with all words altogether. But let's first of all go back to word cult. And Google tells us that it is first of all a system of religious venerations and devotions directed to a person or object surrounded by summary of beliefs and theology, whatever. Then there is a second meaning, that it is a relatively small group of people having kind of a strange, bizarre, even sinister convictions and living like a ghetto, surrounded by the walls. And the third meaning is a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or being or thing. Now, when I was growing in the Soviet Union, two meanings of this word cult were prevalent. And the first one, that was a cult of personality. It was cult of Stalin. Cult of Joseph Stalin. Obviously, it came in a process of demythologization of this cult by Khrushchev. In the time of Stalin, he never called about his own cult, because he himself presented himself not like an historical figure. We never saw Stalin as he was in his everyday life. We saw the monument of his, icons of his. And in these icons, he represented, he embodied the great utopian picture of the absolutely beautiful Platonic communist society, but not only the picture of this utopian society, but also the process and weight of this society. So it was all somehow embodied in his figure. And not only is his figure, but he stood, he was buried in a monument, mausoleum, like pharaohs, Egyptian pharaohs of old. But it was also not only Stalin himself, he was a representative of the whole edifice of the Soviet culture. A culture that even got a name of it, social realism. It was not realism in the real sense that it reflected reality. No, it presented an image of reality, of this utopian future, as if it is already existed here. And this pictured reality actually covered and screened the real reality of life under Stalin. And what was this reality? This reality was better described in these kind of pictures, which then got a name, Gulag Archipelago. It was not a picture done by Solzhenitsyn himself, but it was actually came from my family album. This is one of the woodcut of my father-in-law, who also happened to be in Gulag. And then when Archipelago was published, he made his also series of illustration to it. Okay, let us go back to cult. So, another word for cult was applied to, let's take first cult of Stalin. It would go to the third definition given by Google, kind of misplaced and excessive admiration of one person, and also describing some kind of very sinister beliefs But these beliefs were held not by a small group of people, but the whole of the Soviet Union, and then the whole of communist system, big communist China, where it overlapped with the cult of Mao, and actually not only of the Soviet system, the Soviet camp so-called, but also the communist system worldwide. So it was not that small, but there was another cult which was kept in a very small and really kind of a covered shelter, and it was called, which was called religion, and particularly Russian Orthodox Church. How would we be called like clergy? We were ministers of cult, ministers of a cult. So two meanings of the cult here. One cult of Stalin produced actually had the enormous body of cultural development around it. Another one was almost voiceless, pictureless, completely kept within the walls of these churches and cathedrals. All right, but what is the relationship between really cult and culture? This relationship was etymologically traced by one of the Russian scholars, philosophers, scientists and priests, Father Pavel Florensky, who in 1937 was executed in Stalin camps. He made very interesting observation that these two words, cult and culture, connected. They came from the same Latin verb colo, colui, cultum, where cult meant, colo meant to first, also had three meanings: to dwell in one place, to worship deities, and also to cultivate piece of land. What a real any farmer is doing, but all three means staying in the same place. You know, whether you just staying in the same place or doing work around, it's a rondo, around. So it repeats itself all the time. Whereas culture, cultura, is a future participle of the same word colui. That means what will ever be producing, issuing from the cult. It is a process, actually, coming out of it, like nature, natura, which will be future participle of the Latin verb nascor, to be born. Something which will ever be born again and again and again, ever in the process of being born. Now, can we say that this cult, the name of cult, title of cult, to any way applicable to the Christian Church? In a way, it does. In what sense? Okay, let's go then a little bit theological. In the beginning of John's Gospel, two verbs are introduced. The verb to be, einai, and the verb become, ginomai. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, right? En archein o logos, logos in pros theon, ton theon, theos in o logos. Then, so that means that logos and God belongs to the realm of being. Whereas the next line goes, everything became through him, and without him nothing became that which has become. Pantadi αυτού εγένετο, εχωρίς αυτού εγένετο uden hogegonen. So, two layers, one level of being, another level of processing, so to say, becoming. Now, in the verse 14, though, Logos leaves his realm of being and enters the a realm of becoming. So, and the Word became flesh. So it is the same words. So the word shuttles back and forth between being and becoming. And therefore, actually, what is Christian worship? Mainly around the Eucharist, where we present every time changing elements like bread and wine, and by the prayer of the Church and the Holy Spirit, it becomes what? The body of Jesus Christ, which is resurrected, as the Church believes. And as it is said in the Epistle to Hebrews, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So he belongs to this realm of being, and then in the same time is accessible in the realm of becoming. Why I'm saying all this? You'll see why. Now let us have some kind of philosophical reflection on that. Doesn't have any kind of general meaning. It does. Again, in the opening chapter of the Hegel will help us. George Hegel, in the beginning of his Science of Logic, point to us. Actually, it believes to be textbook example that pure being is equal to nothing, because it cannot be determined by anything that exists. What you can say about nothing? You can say about nothing, because it's nothing, right? But what you can say about being? It's also what being? What is? Who is? That will be a determination of isness. But pure isness is undescribable, right? So, but in the same time, they are absolutely distinct. Nothing and being. But being distinct, nevertheless, they are inseparable within the movement of becoming, because the movement implies and represents, as Hegel said, the immediate vanishing of the one in the other. Something comes out of nothing and moves toward being, but always in the state of becoming, never reaching this state of being, right? As we say about ourselves, so I was born, I was growing young boys, and I was growing adult men, and I was growing, then I'm growing old, right? So, and when it's all done, I'm no more here, right? So, even today, while I was driving here, there were two big signs on the road. First, the life is a highway, and I want to ride it. So, highway, it's always process. It's a becoming, right? Reaching towards the goal, and where is the goal? The next slogan, which I saw also, a big display, a schoolgirl with a book, and it is written, "Be always what is next." So you always kind of extended to what is next in front of you. Why, again, I'm saying that? Because that is explanation of the connection between cult, which tries to be in the same place and repeats itself, and culture, which is a process issuing from it. You know, from the Westerners, and particularly for the people of the Roman Catholic tradition, even of Reformed tradition in the West, it's self-evident that cult and culture are connected. Let's go to any museum where art from, let's say, Middle Ages to late Renaissance is displayed, and you see it clearly. It's all it's all taken from the Bible, from the Scripture, from the church life, from life of the saints, or it's mythological, but also connected to those religious beliefs of the ancient. So it is here. You go to a concert hall, you hear the masses of Bach and Handel and Vivaldi, who was a priest, even a Mozart, who was not exactly a Christian, but nevertheless his requiem, his masses, and all his music, as one of the Russian writer, philosopher Semyon Frank said, when you hear Mozart, you know, you hear as angels are playing all the time. So it is the real process of culturing, so to say. But not only that, the Western Christianity produced the social body, not only social body, but social network, an intellectual blood system of the whole society, which is called a university system. You know, recently I read very serious 4 volumes that appeared, The History of University in Europe, by Walter Roeg as a general editor, where it is clearly said that university systems that exist today globally is a product of medieval Christianity. Started with the Catholic Church, and it embodied in itself 2 different principles. On one hand, Christian principles that, first of all, the truth, a reality, can be decoded. It can be decoded because it's rational. And it can be decoded by a human being because human being's mind is Homo sapiens, is somehow compatible to this reasonableness of the world. It's first principle. And the second, independence. So these institutions were born as a guilds of independent scholars and students who, though were believers, or were supposed to be believers, but not necessarily so, but the only goal of theirs was pursuing the truth in collegiate, collective enterprise. So, so it is we know that the first universities were run by 2 ancient orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, then came Jesuits, and after all, you are here in Catholic University of Augustinian tradition, so nothing to say. But nothing like that existed in the Orthodox world, about which I'm going to speak now. We can say, how come? We go to any cathedral in the world, we see beautiful icons and beautiful singing, and the worship is absolutely magnificent. You know, you can't forget about everything while you're presented there. But it is within the walls of the church. Within the walls of the church. It repeats itself here and here, but it does not go into the culture. Byzantium was extremely sophisticated society, much more than Western Europe in those days. And they had even universities, but it were not exactly universities of the Western type. It was state university, run by state to produce state officials for the purpose of the state and the church. And actually the first university was even located in Imperial Palace. Even the worst condition was in Russia itself, because Russia before Peter the Great didn't have universities at all, didn't have almost higher education. It was churchly culture, deeply Orthodox, but outside of it, uneducated. So, therefore, when Peter brought in university system, as you all learned, it was secular. It was designed after the Western model of university and brought here to Russia, first of all, by German Lutheran professors. So many Russians joined it. And they came from where? From seminaries. But when they came from seminaries and became professors in Russian universities, they didn't come as priests. No, they left seminary. They made the transition to this secular world, from one to another. And these worlds were not connected at all. Actually, Russian seminary was a closed shop in itself, without its own language. That's what is interesting. Because Church Slavonic is a language of what? Church Slavonic is a language of worship. It was never a spoken language. It was designed to mirror the Byzantine liturgy in Slavonic languages, only for worship. You cannot talk on it, you cannot read on it, you cannot write on it. So there is no development. It's like Kalui. It's, you know, it is just works in a roundabout way as a cult. But, you know, in living educational process, you need to have some kind of language. What did they use? They used Latin. because Latin actually was not only the language of the Roman Church, which was obviously until the Second Vatican, as we all know, but it also became the language of academia. That means that it became intellectually living language. And until the second part of the 19th century, doctoral dissertations had to be presented in two languages in Europe, in the vernacular and in Latin. It's interesting that Russian students in the seminary studied in Latin, on Latin's textbooks, until also the end of the 19th century. But in the same time, they were human beings, right? They were Russians, and they needed language for, like all of us. We cannot talk all the time in a foreign ancient language, right? We need our own. But our own language, where it came from? It came from a secular Russia, particularly for this time from the secular part of intelligentsia, which became at that time anti-clerical, very nihilistic, and in most cases embracing, in those days, current ideas of atheism and complete secularism. And actually, we know that many of these ideologists in Russia came from this seminarian backgrounds for many reasons. I have no time now to talk about this because we need to go to the Soviet part. So, what to say when Stalin himself came from a seminary? He was expelled from the third grade of Georgian Seminary for his revolutionary activity. Now, why I'm saying all that when the revolution came, it pushed away all of this culture together with its religion. And this religion, Russian Orthodox Church, was very much part of the old Russian imperial culture, which Soviet Russia was about to reject completely and totally forever, to build new future, new society, which it started, engaged into building right away. And what happened with the church? Annihilated slowly, but surely. And Stalin himself did the major job in it. In 1932, maybe you know about it, the new 5-year plan was accepted by the Soviet Communist Party, and it was called Godless Пятилетка, Безбожная Пятилетка, Godless 5-year plan. So we have to overcome in these 5 years all religious superstitions. How do you better way to kind of overcome religious superstitions? First of all, to get rid of those who are carriers of it, of our class, right? So that's exactly what happened in the end of it, when all those who remained were executed, or just few people just remained. The first step was the closing of monasteries altogether in 1932. In 1937, those who survived, even in labor camps, most of them were executed. Some survived, and then survived to the years of the war. But war brought change in Soviet attitude towards the church for two reasons. First, when Germans advanced, the churches began to be open on these territories taken by Germans. But it was a minor thing for Stalin. The major was that Russia, Soviet Union, was alone, surrounded by Germany on one side, which already took all of the Europe, and Japan on the Far East, right? And there were only two allies, prospective allies. That's the democracies of United States and Britain. And these democracies said to Stalin, look, we're still Christian countries, the people elect our governments and they are Christians, so we cannot just go into the war with our ally who is openly atheistic and, persecute believers. So you better stop it, then we'll be able to open the second front. So, Stalin did it. I'm talking about Stalin because by that time, there was no so-called party democracy. The decisions were made by one particular person. It was him. So the church was restored in a very strict way. Only those who survived, only those who were completely kind of in agreement to collaborate with this government were invited to open the small council of about 20 people that restored the church operations, elected so-called patriarch Sergius. Well, he was patriarch, obviously, but we wouldn't definitely call it a free election. And the church was established, re-established, but exactly as a cult, as a ministers of the cult. Absolutely divided from the society by the wall. So first of all, they were forbidden, we were forbidden to act outside of the church walls on the one hand, to preach to anybody, to convert anybody, and those from a secular part of it, educated people, and there were many educated people in Russia, in the Soviet Union, because they needed propagandists for the whole world and for their own society. You know, if reality is so meager, you have to change, you have to replace the reality, or better to say, push it away by propaganda. But propaganda needs those who can do this propaganda: journalists and writers, and teachers and professors, and musicians and movie makers, you name it. And it was done. So it's a huge army of intellectuals, and they were all secular. And this time, then, we come to our, let's say, pictures, because now we are after Stalin. Stalin is no more. Our friend, very good friend of ours, who was a Russian lady who lived in America, happened to marry, it was her second or maybe third marriage, to the grandson of Stalin, whose name was Djugashvili. He was younger than she, and he took her to Georgia. He took her to Georgia, where she lives now, because she's really a linguist, and she learned Georgian, and Georgian is, you know, and she loves to live in Georgia. But he brought her to Georgia and left her. So she took another name. First, her name was Djugashvili, right, which was the original name of Joseph Stalin. And after Djugashvili left her, she now signs as Djugashvili no more. So, so actually, with Russia was with Djugashvili no more. So, what started to be there? I tell you what, I have to enter again my password. And that's a problem, because I forget it very often. Yeah, but I hope now we're here. So, Khrushchev started what you say, what he started? Thaw, defrosting. Society started to defrost. But from what is defrosting itself? From fear. From fear. Because everybody was afraid. And to the point how everybody was afraid, you learn step by step. When I was 15-year-old or 14, I met first my uncle. I met my uncle first time, many of my uncles, just one, Yakov, because he came out of the labor camp where he spent 20 years. So there was no wonder that I met him first time, because he was in labor camp. But I also made acquaintances with him, because I never heard of him. Because in our family, in my family, no one ever speak a word that I have another uncle. Everybody was afraid to mention his name. As well as later, I knew about those who also were never mentioned, who were simply executed of 1937. And I was not the only one, believe me. Because particularly in those days, I started to meet people who were arrested, and actually it was called political prisoners. We're not talking about criminals. We're talking about those who were condemned as political criminals against the Soviet Union and Stalin himself, whatever kind of things, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, and whatever you can say could be kind of labeled as anti-Soviet propaganda and so on and so forth. And all right, it's you read the literature. You cannot be all explained in a short presentation, but nevertheless, it all began to pour out. And first, people who really wrote about it, there were two writers of whom obviously you should heard. That's Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Varlam Shalamov. Varlam Shalamov wrote his Kalimsky story, one of the first things he spent, and it is absolutely marvelous literature. Horrible, but marvelous literature. And by the way, in one of the stories, but not in a big, it's small object, was about this uncle of mine. It's called Лагерный врач, the labor camps physician, because he at one point Shalamov was a student nurse. You know, they need to prepare some kind of medical personnel in labor camps, right? The people are sick and dying all the time, and there was no. You cannot bring doctors from the freedom, because from the free zone, so to say, not from freedom. No one was free, but from free zone, so to say. Why? Because all this archipelago gulag supposed to be, I'm sorry about it, supposed to be hidden, sheltered completely. It was secret, kind of, which everybody knew, and everybody was afraid of. So they had these classes, for surgeons, for nurses. My uncle, who survived for a long age, he spent there 20 years, and he told me he did 10,000 surgeries, and one upon himself, because there was no other surgeon. So there was either he had to die from, or just operate himself. So he did. But what the point is that all of a sudden, the truth about society, which everybody knew, started to be voiced out and shown by. Okay. It was shown in this kind of various representations. It also came from the family archives. It's done by my father-in-law, who also on his own spent his own years in Gulag. And when Archipelago was published, he made his sets of woodcuts, being also an artist. So kind of you can see, look, of these pictures of this, that is called the working on the railroad building in Siberia or something like that. That's how that is what they take away, sorry about it, fecalia of the camp somewhere, this all in hands. And then you come home, if you do home. How to make it bigger, I don't know. All right, let's move on. Because sometimes it freezes, as you all know. And we have to wait for Khrushchev defrosting of this computer. Another one. Northern Nights Nightlight. It kind of some. All right, but there are many things like that, and also with the defrosting, people start to express themselves, write, sing, compose songs and perform them. Where? In private apartments, mainly in kitchens. Why in kitchens? Because, in Russian life and Soviet life, we didn't have, this what to say, in bedrooms we didn't have community hall, so to say. So you just, I want to show you one particular man who was very known bard, Yuli Kim. Where is he here? Can't find. Right. All right. So the expression, cultural expression, started to flow freely, and the people who want to express themselves outside of so-called social realism just had to publish it themselves on a typewriter or something, giving to friends, very narrowly distributing it, but eventually these things found their way to the West, and they're published there. And there are two particular artists, two writers, Sinyavsky and Daniel, who also, it is another set. There's a picture of Kim. Cannot enlarge it. I don't know why it's not clicking right in my computer. All right, I'll forget about it. So that's what I wanted to say, to show you, enlarge it, but I cannot. Anyway, it's a very bad photo. I took it from somewhere. Yuli Kim, a famous Soviet bard, very sarcastic toward the Soviet reality, who's still active. Actually, he's still. That is his picture of 50s, late 50s and early 60s, performing his songs with a guitar accompaniment in some small friend's apartment. It was usually recorded. This recorded was spread out, and people were singing all these things, so that the country, the people were singing and reading actually what was produced by Samizdat, what was done unofficially. But obviously, we're talking about this communist system. And in spite of the defrosting, it cracked down on these things. So when Sinyavsky and Daniel, who wrote under the pen name of Abram Terz and Arjak, were published in the West, so KGB found it eventually who wrote them, and they were arrested. They were arrested, and they were on trial, and they were I have to wrap up very quickly. They were sentenced. They were sentenced in 1965, and in 1965, the first demonstration took place in their defense, and that's the beginning of the so-called dissident movement. It was announced on the 5th of December, which is the anniversary of accepting of the Stalin's constitution, adopting Stalin's constitution in 1937, that announced the Soviet Union as absolutely free society with the freedom of speech, freedom of union, freedom of expression, without no abolishing death penalty, where in a time where hundreds of thousands of people were executed. And so the people, people organized this demonstration. I knew about this demonstration. I even kind of a plan to attend it. It was in Pushkin Square near the monument of Pushkin, kind of the poet of Russian liberty, traditional things. So, but a little bit I was afraid. I came to my friend. We drank vodka to kind of to boost myself, to kind of. So when I came already late. In which sense, maybe subconsciously I was not speeding to 200, because I knew what, I was afraid it wasn't going to. So I saw 6 people or 7 people standing by the monument of Pushkin, surrounded by thick chain of police, and then so-called communal police in communal form, so-called komsomol druzhinnikis. So, and they were watching these people who stand there with their faces white as a chalk. And at one moment, a central figure, Lena Titova, Helen Titov, unscrolled a scroll. It was about 20, 25 feet long, and on it was written, respect your own constitution, all these things. And at this very moment, all this police force jumped on them, scrambled them like that and threw them into police cars standing nearby. It took maybe 50 seconds, maybe a minute and a half, and there was no more. And then they were dispersing us. I came with some other people who also became later. We came a little late, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. Already, there was impossible to join these things. And it was dispersed, nothing happened. But then later, it was called the beginning of the human rights and dissident movement in the Soviet Union. And what was dissident movement? Dissident movement was a name or title given to this movement from the West. From the point, Russians never called it this way, Soviets. How do they call them? The best way to call it, it's to call it kind of a law enforcement initiative of civilians. In which sense? We know what law enforcement is in our country, right? But Soviet Union, in its legislation, was a free society. So there were human initiatives, human rights organizations that said, look, we are civilians, but we want to help you to enforce legislation, our free legislation in our own country. When Brezhnev signed Helsinki Agreement in 1975, what happened? The Helsinki Watch Committee sprang out in Moscow. And they soon were arrested. But the point why they kind of sprang out is, we help you to implement Helsinki Agreement signed by Soviet Union, not only somewhere else, but also in our own country. And so that was the point of human rights movement that began in the Soviet Union in those days. Now, where is this Father Alexander in this picture? Unfortunately, yes, it's too many things to talk about in one day. Father Alexander was not a member of this dissident movement. Actually, he was educated. Actually, he was baptized by his mother and his aunt, who were of Jewish background, who met underground priest, Father Batyukov, Serafim Batyukov, in 1935, when church was absolutely non-existent in the Soviet Union. And they were so impressed by his personality and by this life of religion, which is really hidden but so powerful in spirit, that they both got baptized and became members of this underground congregation. And they brought, Helen Meny, mother of Alexander Meny, brought her children also in this phase. First of all, Alec, and then here her younger brother, his younger brother Pavel. So Alec Meny grew up in the catacomb church, but as such, he was very traditionally believer from his childhood. But very early, he realized that the church lacks cultural language to speak to the society outside of it, and he took as his task to create this language for the church. Actually, so he was intellectual of many, many ways. Actually, so he first of all wrote his own series on religion and the culture, religious culture of humankind. There was 7 volumes, written on one way, very scholarly way. They had 1,000 footnotes, but easily readable. And actually, they were devoured by people in our time. And that's how actually I was introduced into this my future occupation to run the underground press. I came to him one day. And I saw that he's, he's printed in a type-written manuscript, and he takes some pictures from the Soviet journals and kind of paste it there. And I asked him, Father, what are you doing here? He said, I just published, my first volume, second volume, The Origin of Religion. So I just want to say, let me help you. So I can do it also together. So I first of all started to publish. You do it with only with typist, 4 or 5 copies. That's the maximum that you can do, because you can say that it's for private use. Otherwise, if you use something like Xerox or something, you are eligible or not eligible, but you will you will be arrested for anti-Soviet propaganda, whatever you publish, which was not censored, and be arrested for your 7 or 10 years. So it was the only way. But this way became very widely spread. Unfortunately, my time running to the end of, actually not to the end, but to your part, let us say. So maybe kind of I hooked you with these pictures because if they, pictures that is not explained is really intriguing. But Professor Father Joseph, who invited me here, said that we should entertain dialogue, questions and answers. Probably you have something to ask. Then go on, and I'll try to answer. If there's no questions, do you want me to? Yes.
I was wondering if you could share with your own experience. Perhaps you've known some of these people that you were talking about. Did you ever meet Father Mann?
I brought all these pictures because I know all of them. That's why. Because there could be thousands of them, right? These people are actually. So let me start. Let me start with, let us say, 2 priests. Let me start with this picture. Father Alexander not only invented the language to speak with intelligentsia, he actually started to speak with them. He was the one, through him the Orthodox Church, being the closed cult, opened itself to culture. And so Soviet intellectuals who knew nothing about religion and was afraid of it. And I understand why you go there, you don't know how to behave there, you don't know what to do with these icons, you don't know how to worship, you don't understand the word, and clergy is afraid of you to begin with. So what do you do with this religion? But at the same time, the church was attracting people, and Soviet people. Why? Because it was the only spot which was not Soviet after all. There was no propaganda about it, about this, about this utopia which already sitting in in your throat. After all, it called you to worship. It called you to something else, to transcend yourself, to go beyond, even to have, spiritually escape this big camp or prison. Before, I was baptized in my childhood, but I was converted when I met Father Alexander. But I was anti-Soviet from my 15th year, because when I entered into this, and I came to the position that I would become a terrorist, because I hated this system so much, and there was no way, and many of my friends actually went this way, to the kind of active political, even military opposition to them. But the Christianity provides for you the way to escape from it somehow. You know that you have some exits even within, so to say, a prison. And it was, by the way, the point, very interesting point of novel, Solzhenitsyn novel, Krugi Первом, in the first circle. Here we see Father Alexander Mein with two artists. It's a Yuri Titov, actually the husband of this Lena Titova, who opened this, scroll and was arrested on this demonstration in 1965. And another one was Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself, who became a Christian because he met Father Alexander. He was a Soviet man. Father Alexander opened to him this reality, the reality of the church, and, but not only that one. Father Alexander not only opening, he was helping in many ways. Let's say, we all know that Solzhenitsyn wrote these things because they were published in the West. But how they got their way to the West? Another story. The Father Alexander was very instrumental in this sense too. There is a friend of ours. Where is he here? Where is he here, Jim Bill? And that's what he is. I didn't manage to put it in good order. Yves Ammann. Well, I'm sitting here with him. It's when I immigrated to France in 1972. Yves Ammann was a French Catholic, a very pious man, but also the Russian specialist, who became big friend of ours in Russia, became big friend of Father Alexander Mein, and wrote a book about him. Very good, which is it's displayed also later there. He wrote it in French, but it was translated into English, and it was translated into Russian. Later, in 1974, he became a cultural attaché at French embassy in Moscow until 1979. Then he was ousted from Moscow. Moscow entered to Soviet Union entered to his Afghanistan adventure, war in Afghanistan. Things were hardened, and Yves was the first translator of Gulag Archipelago into French, which Soviet didn't like at all. So they ousted him as but he remained our friend. Obviously, and friend of Father Alexander. And recently, about a week ago, I found an article which was written by him in French and translated into Russian, published in a late issue of the journal Christianos, published by our friend in Latvia. It's a ecumenical journal in Russian. When he speaks about this woman, Asa Durov, who worked in Russian emigre woman, who worked with such a Russian face, which let it be very kind of deceptive. She's kind of dressed here like a Russian babushka, being a French Catholic nun living in France, of a very kind of famous Russian descent of Durov's military family, and her grand mother was also Asa Durov, who was fighting the patriotic war with Napoleon in 1812. She came from a military family, and as a young girl, 15, she decided to join the army. She obviously couldn't, but being able to fence and also to ride a horse, she dressed herself as a young officer and joined that quarter of Kutuzov, which, So, but Asa was actually, she was a friend of ours. She was as brave, maybe even braver than her ancestor, working in Moscow as a bridge. And Yves Ammann wrote this article, Asa as a bridge between Moscow and France. Because through her, and she was a friend of mine, she was a friend of our young friend Barabanov, she was a friend of Father Alexander, who was who bring things that we collected and wrote in Samizdat to the West. First of all, writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn himself, She helped to do this with the Nadezhda Mandelsham memoirs, also through Father Alexander. Other writings of Solzhenitsyn and many others. So she worked there for I don't remember for how many years. She was this connecting bridge between Soviet underground and herself. I had to.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure, absolutely. Sorry.
Just recently this month, a group of Russian clergy wrote a protest letter against, say, the Putin way. Could you comment on that, please?
It's interesting. Yes, the topic which I didn't even arrive to talk about it, Russian religious renaissance, is not that Russian religious restoration. What we have today is a restoration of the state of affairs as it was, or at least as it was before the revolution. So both the church and the state wanted not all the church, but top of it, which anyway was of Soviet mold, actually. They were kind of put to the position under the Soviet Union. They wanted to make the church again kind of acceptable to the state institution. And state was interested in the church as a replacement of the old system of ideology. What was exactly what Father Alexander opposed, and very dramatically. I'll just read his little credo, which once he shared with others, and you'll see why. His words, it's quotation. For me, the Christianity I profess is a dynamic force that encompasses all aspects of life, open to everything that God created in nature and man. I regard it not so much as a religion that is 20 years old, as a way to the future. This Christianity is a religion of freedom. It professes freedom as a basic law of the spirit and regards sin as a form of slavery. It rejects authoritarianism and paternalism, which are grounded not in the spirit of faith, but rather in fallen human nature. This Christianity whips over divisions among Christians as our common sin and transgression against the will of Christ. But it believes that in the future, this sin will be overcome in the spirit of brotherly love, rather than by the way of pride, self-righteousness, and self-exaltation. Therefore, the Christianity that I profess is open to everything valuable in other Christian denominations. It does not reject the good which comes from unbelievers, but it rejects violence, dictatorship, hatred, even if they use Christ's name as a cover. It takes public life as a domain for the gospel's principles to be applied. It measures a political system by its humanness, by what it gives to a human being. It considers separation of church and state the most favorable condition for the church and sees a danger in the very idea of state religion. And that's exactly for not only these words, but for all his life in which he embodied these principles. Because of that, he was killed in 1990. He was killed in 1990 precisely because many, not many, but powerful people in the church itself were afraid of this type of Christianity. They believed, no, we're a traditional cult, we want to stay this way, we are a state church and we want to continue as a state church. On the other hand, there was a strong movement within this party, already not so much party, but KGB, which realized that all doctrine, communist doctrine, is completely dead. You need to build so they wanted to make Orthodox Church as a controllable, adjustable to its ends institution. They couldn't do it completely, but you see the Father Alexander's main figure stood against that, and he was so popular in the last days because he was a man who could speak to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. He had this personal charisma to speak with many people. You know, one of the books which is featured here is called, recently published, it's called Цветочки, Цветочки of Alexander Meny. Where it is? Where is this book actually? Yeah, too little time for everything. I don't see it here. Yeah, unfortunately. But it's taken from the book, famous medieval collection of stories about St. Francis of Assisi, Little Flowers of Francis of Assisi. There's a Little Flowers of Father Alexander Main. A big book. My testimonies is there, but when I read it, I met so many interesting testimonies about from other people. He had a charisma to become a personal friend with a person whom he meets, and kind of win his confidence. But I believe that my time is over. If you have any last questions, I would like to answer. And then, there are many literature to read about, and anyway, I wouldn't be able to cover everything if it's impossible to, envelop everything.
Thank you very much, Oleg.
Thank you, Richard.